Welcome to Phenomenal Conversation, probably number 21 or 2. I'm welcoming today Robin Alfred on the topic of leader as mystic. And just a little bit of background on Phenomenal Conversations. This is a new initiative where I do one-on-one interviews. Once monthly, I'll be doing a one-on-one interview with change makers that are living the change like Robin. And then the other, we'll do a group conversation once a month, last Tuesday in the month. So that's the kind of preview in summary. And now we're going to dive in with Robin. I'm going to ask him to tell us a little bit of his journey to now be promoting leader as mystic. So love to hear what you have to say about this topic, Robin.
Yeah, thanks, Dave. It's great to be with you. And yeah, where does the journey begin? I mean, I was born into a Jewish family. I guess I was always a spiritual seeker, let's say. I didn't really find it in the Jewish religious framework. I remember going to Israel when I was 17 and talking to people about why they believed in God, and did God talk to you from a tree, or like, did he come to you in a dream, or what happened? And I didn't really meet much until I came to a place called Findhorn, which is where I currently live, which is in the north of Scotland, which is an eco-village and a spiritual community. And there I had a kind of epiphany, which was around feeling, a strong heart opening and a sense of love beyond the personal, let's say, to the people in my group and into the community space. And I came back, long story, but I went back and forth for a few years, and then I came back to live here 30 years ago. And then I've really had 3 main teachers, I would say. And one was Eileen Caddy, one of the founders of Findhorn. I then had a Sufi practice and teacher for about 6.5 years. So strangely enough, for a Jewish boy, I was praying in Arabic and facing Mecca and doing Ramadan and things like that, and really loved the kind of, basically the similarity between these 2 faiths, because from a mystical point of view, of course, it's all the same, just has different strands and flavors. So I have a strong kind of Islamic streak that also kind of runs in me, or Sufi streak anyway. And then for the last 15 years, I've been studying with a person I would consider a contemporary mystic, Thomas Hübl. And through that, and I've done a lot of leadership development work as a consultant for many years, I started to feel that what he brings and what I've accumulated in terms of embodied understandings and insights over the past, whatever, I'm now 66, so, a chunk of life, feels like they come together into what I'm calling leader as mystic. So when we look at and face and encounter the world as it is today, let's call it the polycrisis that the world faces: climate change, loss of biodiversity, increased polarization, war, refugee movements, many, many aspects of challenge. It's clear to me that trying to meet them with the orientations that we've currently used, which are generally more, let's say, horizontal, based around our 5 senses, what we know, the people who we connect to, the frameworks that we're already familiar with. We kind of put them into tomorrow. We kind of call it the future. We hope that it will serve. But actually, there are sources, and I would call that's the core of mysticism. There are energetic principles. There is inspiration. There's a deeper understanding of the flows of life that is less tangible, more intangible, more hidden in that sense, that we can tap into, that will help us both orientate and have agency at this time.
I think you've almost answered all my questions in one go. So that was a very neat encapsulation. For people listening in who might not be sure, I mean, you've mentioned your own teachers. What do you think kind of qualities or ways of being that do a mystic typify or express that isn't part of the normal way of being in the world, as it were?
Yeah, it's very interesting. I first thought of myself as I would call myself an aspiring mystic. Like, to say I'm a mystic feels a bit arrogant and like, oh, I have a kind of access to wisdom that other people don't. So it doesn't feel like that in me at all. But a friend of mine actually introduced me when I was doing a leadership development training in Oxford for his organization. He said, and he's a friend of mine, so he's known me since university. And he said, and he introduced me as a mystic. And I was a bit like, whoa, what do you mean? And he said, well, a mystic is really a seeker of truth. And I thought, oh, well, that resonates with me. And of course, mysticism, in my understanding, is a seeking of, and if we move in that direction, an increasing embodiment of, let's say, the highest form of truth that is available to us. So, this is where we get into kind of complex territory, because some people will immediately switch up as soon as you talk about frameworks that involve kind of higher levels of consciousness. But I think there are higher levels of consciousness. And at the highest level of consciousness, there's what I would say is an absolute truth. There's a level of reality which is not perceptible to me. I don't access that. I think truly awakened people do access, if not the absolute truth, something very much approaching that. And to me, a mystic is someone who is aspiring to move in that direction. So to move from the world of relative truth, like I see things as they are. No, I don't really see things as they are. I see things as I am and as I perceive them through my filters. So as I become more and more naked, let's say, as I strip away more and more of the filters, the conditioning, the trauma seas that I swim in, all the other things that kind of block me or that might inhibit me or that give me a shading as I look at life, then I become more and more free, more and more naked, and I approach more of an absolute truth. And from that perspective, many things that don't make sense start to make sense. Paradoxes start to resolve. I get a sense of, as I said, of orientation and agency. And mystics are people who have I guess the essence of it is they have a bigger perspective on life.
Yeah.
And a wish to cultivate that.
Beautifully described. I loved all the detail on that. I'm kind of inclined to just question a little bit around this notion of a higher truth, because of course we live in almost post-truth times where nobody can agree on what is true or not. So what is it about that truth that makes it so all-consumingly important or definite or more has more value than, say, relative truth? What is it about that as a mystic, as a seeker of truth?
Oh, I love the question, because I think we want to really distinguish this from fundamentalism. It's not saying like, this is the truth, you need to believe it, I have it, you don't. It's not about that at all. It's really, and one of the things that mysticism is about is that we each find our own way to the truth as we embody it. And for me, it's more a felt experience. It's like those moments where your whole body, heart, mind, nervous system say, yes, this is true.
Okay.
That's what I mean. And there are those moments where, in a way, we might say the universal law or higher ethics land in our system. We go, boom, that's true. This is not quite so true. This is definitely like fake news and whatever else. And if we're sensitive enough, we can often distinguish fake news from, let's say, real news. But there's a place where we just know something. It's like you meet your partner, let's say, and you fall in love. Well, what is that? That's there's a deep knowing, right? Like, oh, this is the person I'm meant to be with. And that is available to us in many domains of life. We often think about it in terms of romance, but it's available to us in terms of what clients I work with. It's available to us in terms of what work I'm meant to do in the world, where I'm meant to live, what house I'm meant to buy and not buy, or rent and not rent. That knowing is available to us if we sensitize this vessel enough to notice, like, how does my body feel? Where is the place of knowing in us? And that's what I mean by the truth that can manifest in each of us.
That's, again, beautifully described. And I think that what I'm getting from what you're saying, I think we tend to think of truth in terms of words and facts and proven ideas, but this seems to be somewhat more than that, a recognition of truth that is more than just the sum of the words or the our notions about what truth is, in a way.
Totally. It's an energetic feeling.
Yeah.
Peter Caddy, one of the other founders of Finton, said, when something is right, it's right all round. He used to say, it's right all right. It feels right on every level. There's a kind of level of practical organization that says, yes, this is doable, but there's a deeper level where it feels like, yeah, this is what we're meant to be doing. Even if rationally it doesn't make so much sense.
Yeah.
Like mystics will often do things that are not so rational because there's a deeper calling that says, yeah, but this is what you're meant to be doing. And then sometimes, amazingly, the universe seems to conspire to help you fulfill it.
Yeah.
But that's because we're aligned to some higher, deeper principle that's working through us.
Beautiful. I love that. So I had an early exchange with you that I'd like to bring some of the flavor in because I really enjoyed this. But mysticism, you could say, is awakening to this perennial truth for various forms like Sufism or Christianity, Buddhism or Judaism. So there's a kind of perennial truth that's available. But we're now living in an Anthropocene. So how do you think mysticism itself needs to change? Because we're living in very different life conditions where almost the perennial may not continue to be perennial. So what's your, love your insight about how the nature of mysticism needs to embrace current life conditions?
Yeah, again, I really like the questions that you're bringing also. So firstly, I would say that when you name those kind of religious frameworks, I think it's really important to distinguish organized religious frameworks from mysticism. So, for example, within Judaism, the Kabbalistic streak is more the kind of mystical strand. Within Christianity, Gnosticism is more the mystical strand. Within Islam, Sufism is more the mystical strand. And what they all have in common, the mystical strands, is that you don't need a mediator, you don't need a rabbi or an imam or a priest to support your journey towards, let's say, the higher truth. You can do it for yourself. You kind of go within and you find your own path. And you can have guides and people who support you for sure, but it's accessible to every individual. So in that way, it kind of democratizes, let's say, spirituality. So I just want to name that. And what I'm interested in is what I'm calling a contemporary embodied mysticism. And each of those words is important. So contemporary means exactly what you're talking to. There is an update that is constantly needed. Like, as I said, I grew up in a Jewish, liberal Jewish environment, and we talked about the nature of progressive revelation. So not like, well, it's written in the Bible, therefore that's how it is forever. No, things are progressively revealed, and they're revealed in all sorts of ways. They're revealed through politics, they're revealed through science, they're revealed through climate change is also revealing other things to us. There's a nature of progressive revelation, which means we are constantly needing to update the wisdom that is embodied in these timeless traditions. It also needs to be embodied. So to come to that, which means it's not just a kind of concept here. It's something that I feel in my heart and in my body, almost like in every cell of my being. And that's also what I mean by the deeper knowing. It's a knowing that is an embodied knowing. So a contemporary embodied mysticism, almost by definition, includes updates. But what's important about the updates is to know where they come from. Because I can update it from my ego stance and just say, well, that bit's not very convenient. So I kind of ditch that and feel like, oh, it's really about this. Or the update is really also a revelation. It comes again from the deepest, highest truth that I can access. And it's not so much about the essence doesn't change, but the expression of it changes. So AI is like coming in, right? The internet comes in. That's not a mistake. It's like it's part of what's happening. So we want to meet it with curiosity, with interest. It is revealing something to us. Like the internet is a kind of external representation of our interconnectedness, right? What a beautiful expression of our interconnectedness, which is what mystics talk about all the time. We are not so separate. We are together. We are one. The internet is a fantastic expression of that. Of course, it wasn't available to mystics 100 years ago, but now what's our relationship to that? So its form maybe changes, or artificial intelligence comes in. What is the gift of that? What is the shadow of that? How do we interface with that? It doesn't mean that the essence of the ethics necessarily changes so much, but the ethical applications change, and the context changes, and the metaphors change, and there is an updating that's needed, and it's happening all the time.
Well, I think that's a very contemporary explanation involving, the latest developments, which I think sometimes mystical or spiritual schools aren't so adaptive or engaged with the world as it is right now, of all these things that cause us concern. So I think that's especially, I like your contemporary embodied, what was the other?
Mysticism. Yeah, mysticism.
Yeah, so I love that formulation. So
yeah, we might just say just maybe one phrase that's helpful that also comes through my teacher Thomas Hubel. We talk about being mystics in the marketplace.
yeah.
Right. So it's not like a mystic. I mean, there is a place for mysticism on the mountaintop, you know, Tibetan monks who maybe live in a cave for 15 years and kind of do their waking up. But that's not the calling for most of us. Most of us are in the marketplace of life, which is what I'm really interested in. That's why I talk about leader as mystic. So how do we bring that understanding, that depth of realization, that high perspective into life, into relationships, into marriages, into organizations, into coaching sessions, into therapy? Like, how do we bring it into life?
That's gorgeous, because in a way, that's the whole reason for the enterprise I'm doing, and the whole reason I'm doing Phenomenal Conversations is I've had privilege and opened up to many awakened states, but I'm more interested in how relevant are they to the world's circumstances as they exist now, and how is it applied. So I think we're kindred spirits on that path. So you mentioned about common culture and the kind of horizontality that is kind of the way of operating in the mainstream at the moment. And generally, I think when you were mentioning, when we last met, about leaders as mystic is a kind of a radical proposition. But I think it's interesting, with your background and history in traditional or less traditional approaches to leadership, what is it that's insufficient about ways of leading today that the mysticism complements or brings in that it was desperately needed?
Again, I really like these questions because I can also feel what you embody in how you bring the questions, which is really lovely. So it's not just a theoretical conversation, it's like an embodied inquiry that we're having. So I like that. Yeah. Well, I wouldn't want to say like all leadership is the same, but I did for about 15 years, I worked in corporations and a fairly senior level doing leadership development. And my general experience was that the planning mind, the kind of logical, rational planning mind that was doing X, Y, Z in order to get A, B, C, without so much of a bigger perspective on why, like without, let's say, a planetary purpose, more kind of purpose that's related to shareholder returns and other things, was often the driving force. So one thing I think that's missing is often a bigger perspective, like what's the contribution? What am I part of? What's this organization part of? That means we want to make what we might call a more planetary contribution. And for sure, that's not so radically new. Like people have been talking about triple bottom line accounting for a long time. So we look at people, planet, purpose. You know, not just and profit, rather, not just profit, but we look at all of that. So that's important, but I think what's missing in a way, or what's available that people aren't tapping into, are sources of inspiration and energy that we can access if we have a more mystical understanding of how energetics work. So I can sit here with you and we have a conversation that's like this, or I can have a higher awareness, and I would like diagrammatically draw it as a kind of triangle, but there's another, let's say, energetic presence that we can invite into the space, which I would call like inspiration or the future. You know, the future is not tomorrow. The future is what is fresh and new that's arriving in presence. So for me, it's about a deeper presence. In a deep presence, something else can drop into the space. We might call it like facilitation is a dialogue with that higher organizing principle. Coaching is actually a dialogue with a higher organizing principle that comes into the space. So it's not a horizontal conversation only. It includes the horizontal conversation, but it also draws in a higher inspiration into the space. That inspiration carries energy, insight, imagination, like many things drop into that space if I'm aware of it. And for leaders to not be able to tap into that keeps us limited. So it expands the possibilities in a way, that's where hope lies, because more can be drawn into the space. So that's maybe one element. And then I think also as we do that, as we draw more, let's say, light into the space and more insights start to dawn, we will also wake up shadows. We'll also wake up trauma layers. We'll also wake up, and that's the other thing that's often missing, is a trauma-informed approach to leadership, which might not sound like mysticism, but it is, because an embodied mysticism also says, yeah, and we're also sitting on frozen lakes of trauma, individual, ancestral, and collective trauma, that we can thaw out with awareness, focused awareness. We can thaw out the frozen layers within us and within our organizations, within our cultures, and start to release energy and insight. So the energy and insight is in a way like top down and bottom up. The innovation is top down and bottom up. And that's a beautiful, rich exploration to go on. And many leaders are just not doing that because they don't have that awareness at the moment.
Might it be interesting for the listener if you could give a concrete example of where you've enabled that? You don't have to name who it is, or where something that shift has happened. To be good there for people to understand what can occur in an organization when that awareness you're describing gets tapped into or is made available.
Yeah, I think when that awareness is tapped into, I mean, often the way in organizational life is through symptoms, right? So people will come and say to me, come and work with my team, we're experiencing a lot of conflict, right? Or there's high turnover in this area, right? Well, those are symptoms of something. I mean, conflict not necessarily bad at all. Conflict can just be a kind of call to intimacy, and there's a friction that's necessary and good when people come together. But the inability to handle conflict is something else. So kind of what it triggers in me when I'm in a conflicted situation is a different thing. Or high levels of turnover, or there's low energy in the IT department. Every time we go in there, everybody seems to like down, like the energy is low. Those are symptoms. And that means that there's an opening then when somebody comes and says, this is what we're experiencing, to explore, not just like, how do we fix the symptoms, or we need to put on better lighting, or we need to kind of give people time off. But from a mystical point of view, what's the energetic flow that is being reduced here, which is manifesting in, let's say, low energy or in staff turnover, because the energy isn't flowing, the chi, if you like, isn't flowing through people and through the organization, through that department. That then becomes an opening to look at both the trauma layers that might be in that space. I will give you an example. The trauma layers that might be in that space, or where the inspiration is lacking. So I'll give you an example. I was working in it was a community organization in south of Scotland. And I was working there doing leadership development, and they had a fairly horizontal structure. They were more like in a collective environment, and they were quite a bit wary of leadership. And things were very stuck, right? Every time I went there, it's like they'd say all the right things, but things were stuck. And then I was just having a dinner with one person who I was staying with, actually. And I said, tell me a bit more about the history of this. And it turned out they also operated a farm. And they had gone through what in the UK we experienced a few years ago is what was called mad cow disease. And they had to slaughter, basically, these animals that they really loved dearly. And they had to slaughter all of their cattle, because that was how the government was controlling the spread of this disease, which was a huge trauma in the organization, which they had never addressed.
Oh,
right? They knew it was like terrible. I mean, they were upset, but they were so upset about it in a way that they didn't feel able to really look at it. And I said, well, maybe one of the reasons why things are stuck here and you can't sort of progress the leadership conversation is because you're sitting on this huge kind of collective trauma piece. And then when you start to pay attention to that, which means you provide more spaces for people to grieve, or people to connect, or people to relate, or tell stories about that, and you start to unfreeze what was a huge frozen shock to the whole organization, then things start to release and move.
Gorgeous example. It shows that overwhelming events, we'd rather get over them and suppress them rather than engage with the pain or the suffering they're in.
Exactly.
So
And maybe just on that note, because one of the ways that I also frame this kind of what does it mean to leader as mystic is to look at what we currently call paradoxes.
Yeah,
And also what I might call a mystical approach to something and a classical approach to something. So exactly what you said around obstacles. Classically, in organizations, you see an obstacle, you want to get rid of it.
yeah,
You want to knock it out the way or walk around it or pretend it isn't there, right? You try to transcend it. But that doesn't work. From a mystical point of view, an obstacle is something to be curious about. It's here. Life is here. This is what the world is presenting me with. So how can I meet it and be curious about it and interested in it? Which means I then start to have a relationship to it, which means in the end, I might be able to transcend and include it. I know you're also a fan of Ken Wilber's work. He talks a lot about transcend and include. Otherwise, we kind of bypass. And many organizations try to bypass difficulties, transcend them. Yeah, but let's just build the new. Yeah, but if you build the new at the expense of integrating the old, it's like a rubber band that will keep pulling you back.
yeah.
So we want to transcend and include, which means we want to say yes to life. That's also what a mystic does. Like whatever is in front of us, say yes to. I accept it fully, and then a change movement becomes possible. If I don't accept it, I'm in resistance to it. I'm wanting to bypass it. And then whatever change I build is not built on any kind of foundation.
And the problem then comes back in new forms or stays exactly where it was. So moving on to leader as mystic, we talked about upgrading or continued revelation as part of the contemporary spiritual path, a way of upgrading and updating wisdom according to circumstance without losing the central ethics, like you were saying. However, often in these days, there's so many contemporary mystics that give away powerful transmission and give people a taste of this higher truth you've been mentioning. Yet they themselves, despite that power, fame, recognition, they themselves have caused enormous suffering, including one of my own teachers, or two of my own teachers, huge sort of public mess that they've caused. So, just digging deeper into this, okay, there's this pristine experience of truth, yet the form within which it's expressed can be corrupted by the power or by the inspiration or adulation of others. So I'm kind of curious about you've mentioned it before, but I'd love the audience to hear a little bit about your take on those circumstances.
Oh, it's a really important question. And I also suffered at the hands. My Sufi teacher was also like abusive after, which I started to notice after a while, which is why I left. And that's not uncommon, as we say, and like as you said, like unfortunately and very painfully in many traditions, that's the case. So, as you know, Ken Wilber talks about 4 lines of development, which makes a lot of sense to me. So he talks about the waking up line, which is our spiritual development, states of meditation, consciousness development. That's that in the people we're talking about, let's say the deeply flawed mystics, the waking up line is often highly developed. So they have a kind of psychic ability, they have an access to a perspective that many of us don't have, which is what makes it so attractive. Then there's a showing up line. What do I do for the world? Those people are often very active in the showing up sense. Also, they build schools and hospitals and make contributions and coffee shops and whatever. They're in the world, they're in the marketplace doing something. So that also makes it very attractive. However, there are 2 other lines which are often not so developed in those people, which is why there's a shadow. So one is the cleaning up line, which means I take responsibility for my shadows. I acknowledge I have shadows. Like my Sufi teacher, I had a long conversation into the night with him once. He said, I don't have a shadow, at which point I felt like I'm out of here because every human being has a shadow. So they acknowledge they have shadows. They take responsibility for working on that, which means they have their own supervisor or therapist or kind of places where they go to kind of clean up messes that we've made, also ethical transgressions that they may have been involved in or witnessed or whatever. There's a cleaning up line. And lastly, there's a growing up line, which means taking responsibility for our psychological development. So some of the people that I've encountered anyway, I would say are very poorly developed on the growing up line and on the cleaning up line, very highly developed in terms of showing up and waking up, which is why they're so attractive. And one of the reasons why I follow the teacher that I have at the moment is because I feel for sure he has a shadow, like Thomas Hübl has a shadow. We all have shadows, but there is a validation and a practice in that field of all of those lines. So you're encouraged to have your kind of therapeutic support. You're encouraged to make contributions to the world. You're encouraged to have your meditation practice or your spiritual development. You're encouraged to take responsibility for your own psychological development, your individuation, and the issues you might have had with your parents, and building healthy relationships, as a mature adult. All those lines of development need attention. And for me, it started to make sense because I often carried this question, like, how can my teacher, for example, who's so awake, be doing such terrible things? And I thought, oh, this actually helped me make sense of that.
Yeah. And I think there's a lot of explanatory power in those 4 dimensions. I'm kind of curious about, in your experience, what does the mystic or teacher or aspirant need to do in the cleaning up line? Because the shadow worker, that's very clear, and the other 2 things I think are clearer, but the cleaning up, what do you perceive as meant by that?
Cleaning up to me is partly about shadow integration. So noticing I have a shadow and taking responsibility for that. It's about cleaning up where I have made mistakes in my life and taking responsibility for those. Because trauma is a commonly used word, but I'm not only a victim of trauma. I have my own kind of individual and ancestral and collective trauma that I carry. There are also places where I have traumatized people.
Yeah.
Not like consciously and feel like, oh, but when I look at my life, I think that I didn't do very well. Here, I was like shouting at somebody in the face and whatever. Here, and we want to take responsibility for that, which might mean like apology, or it might mean restoration of the relationship somehow. So I think it also means that, like, taking responsibility for errors that I've made, or for places where I've violated my own sense of ethical responsibility, and saying, yeah, I did that.
Yeah.
I did that. And naming that and honoring that and taking responsibility for that and trying to repair places where I have also damaged life.
I think that's a very interesting point, because there's, as you were speaking, I'm thinking that's true humility. Because all this other stuff that you're talking about, in a way, owning up to what you've done and admitting it, to me, seems to really highlight your humanity, whereas much of the imbalance is the sort of overemphasis on godlikeness and perfection and heaven and utopia, and not enough admission. One of my former teachers, another one, used to mention, does his poop smell, in terms of the spiritual teacher actually admitting their own humanity. So there seems to be something humbling to the ego, but also genuine humility by owning up. And I'm glad you've expanded upon that a little bit.
Yeah, I think that's super important. And that's why I talk about an embodied mysticism, because this mysticism that I'm interested in is not a transcendent state. Yeah. It's not a bypassing. It's not like you just now use words like heaven and bliss. It's not about that. I mean, there may be happy states or blissful states, but it's much more about how do you apply all that in the marketplace of life. We are in a body for a reason.
Yeah.
Right? David Spangler, one of the early teachers at Finton, talked about incarnational spirituality.
Yeah.
Like spirit, if you like, can't do its work without us. We need to be informed. There's nothing. It's not like the human is a mistake, and all there really is this kind of high consciousness. No, it's the meeting of the two.
Yeah.
We have a personality. Let's enjoy it. We have a body. Let's enjoy it. We're in matter. Let's enjoy that, and let's also know that that's not all there is.
Yeah. Yeah. Which I think is that limitation is part of the complex predicament that we're in, is the lack of acknowledgement of the other side. Right. So one of the things I've heard this model about wake up, grow up, clean up, etc., show up, etc., a number of times. One of the things that struck me about it is it's very individualized, and we live in cultures where students give over their power to teachers. and let them abuse them to some respect, out of deep yearning for good reasons of wanting to realize and discover that deeper truth. But to me, there seems to be, in some ways, the individual is important, but what seems to be missing from that picture is the social and cultural dimension that allows these characters, to make a mess, as it were.
Yeah, I think that those lines are equally applicable on a collective level.
Yeah.
So we could name them exactly the same, but let's just put the word collective in front of them. So there is a collective waking up process also. Yeah. There's a collective cleaning up, like I just completing a training in collective trauma integration, right? That's like collective cleaning up.
Yeah.
So as I'm currently running a trauma integration lab, which is called the collective trauma of being Jewish, persecution and perpetration. Right. So we're looking at both aspects of Jewish experience, which is my own lineage. Where have we been victims of anti-Semitism, and where are we also perpetrators?
Yeah.
So that's a kind of collective cleaning up process.
That's beautiful.
And I think that that's also necessary. And there's a collective. So I think each of those, there's a collective showing up. How do we create culture where we care for each other through a health service that is a collective enterprise, for example, or schools are collective bodies. So we collectively, we need to be collectively responsible in those domains. So I think each of those lines has a collective dimension. And one person that I also respect locally here, she added a fifth dimension to these 4 lines. She said she called it syncing up. Like who do we synchronize with? Syncing in that sense. Like who do we synchronize with to build the collective fields also? And there's a line of development, if you like, in who we also synchronize and connect to.
Not that I want to go into it, but just for people that don't know, I mean, Thomas Hübel's work has focused a lot on collective healing. So in a way, it's implicit in the kind of movement around Hübel and what he's doing is this collective cleaning up, which I think is not so emphasized in the Wilber world. I don't think it's emphasized enough.
Yeah, because I think I respect Ken Wilber a lot, but Ken Wilber doesn't really meet clients.
No.
Right? He's more kind of on the mountaintop.
Yeah.
Thomas and the rest of us who kind of work with Thomas Hübel, and also my work as a social worker before I was a criminal justice social worker. I mean, we're kind of in the world. And it's very clear. My wife ran the Global Eco-Village Network for many decades. And there you're meeting communities. And the first thing you notice when you sit down with a group of people, you have aspirations to build the new, as you're doing, for example, where you're living. And as soon as you sit down with a group, the collective trauma fields start to be manifest. You work with a group of people in Congo, the trauma field is there. You work with people in South Africa, the trauma field is there. So we have to pay attention to that, or we're building on rocky foundations that are doing this all the time. If we just try to build the new without integrating and thawing out the trauma layers that it's founded on, we're not going to be sustainable.
But your story about mad cow disease
exactly,
it illustrates quite perfectly. I think we're coming to the end of the interview now, Robin. It's been a real delight. I kind of, as a change maker on this edge of, leaders as mystics, and the fact that we're in these, some would call it whether polycrisis or extinction event or the Anthropocene or whatever. What do you draw on that gives you hope that there could be a different turn where humanity can learn and grow from this bump in the road or event on our journey? What are you drawing on? What do you think keeps you going in a way? Because when you contemplate mathematically, scientifically, all the overwhelming degree of negative information out there on the way that it's going, what do you draw on that gives you hope of a different possibility or potential for humanity?
Yeah, lots of different levels, I think, to answer that question. I mean, to be honest, I'm a little bit wary of hope
Right. Okay.
Because I feel like hope can be a way of avoiding what's actually happening. Like, oh, we're just going to hope for a better future.
Yeah.
But what about how related are you to what's happening today? There's a future that we build because we don't like what we have. And there's a future that we build because it's what's evolving that we want to support.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I'm more
Yeah.
tuned in a way to the latter. Otherwise, I'm in resistance to what is.
Yeah.
So part of my practice is to build as much and cultivate as much presence as I can. So I have a meditate for an hour in the morning. And I wouldn't say it gives me hope, but it gives me it's because it's not about cultivating hope, but it's more about becoming more and more present to what is. When I'm more and more present to what is, and I also do this with groups of people, because I think collectively we need to come together to hold the collective crisis and crises that we face. Then when we presence it enough, when we slow down enough and feel ourselves, and we have an embodied experience of interrelationship with the crises that we are encountering, a movement starts to arise. I get a sense of, oh, this is what I'm called to do next.
Yeah.
And that's it for me. All I know is what I'm called to do, right? Yeah. And then I need to be still enough, quiet enough to know that. Then I need to have the courage enough to do that. And then I need to trust. I don't know if we're going to make it. I don't even know what really making it looks like. We're already not making it. Like, people are dying, and sea levels are rising. Pacific islands are going underwater. Refugee movements are huge. We're already not making it. There's already like war in too many places. So it's not like some future state that we're not going to make it. We're not making it now, if we look like that. But what we can do is play our part in the orchestra of life as fully as we can. And then we feel like that to me is what's essential. Tune into my essence, help other people to find what is essential to them. That's what all my work is about now, is helping people to find, like, what is it you're meant to do on planet Earth? What is it you're meant to do with this? As Mary Oliver says, what is it you plan to do with your one wild and precious life? And if everybody was doing that, the world would be a different place.
I think I'm writing an article where exactly I've used those words and almost expressed the very similar thing in a different way. Right. So thanks so much, Robin. It's been a real pleasure to interview you and draw out your wisdom and your elegant way of describing and speaking. So thanks so much. And I'm going to close off the interview now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dave. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Just, where is it? Oh, here. Stop.